Good morning, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of our discussion of ethics in addiction treatment. We have the slide up now that shows your audio options, and hopefully as you were signing in, you were taking a look at that, and you can see how you can call in if you have questions, or if you prefer, just use your chat function and type in your questions, and hopefully I'll be able to see them on the screen over there and give you an answer. This is part 2 of our ethics series, total of 3 hours, and we welcome you back and hope that you've had a chance to act ethically since the last time we met. I'm Jim Aiello, the director of the Northeast Addiction Technology Transfer Center, and here's a few housekeeping things we need to address. First of all, before the series began, you were sent what's called a pre-GPRA questionnaire. I believe it was in a SurveyMonkey type of format. When we complete this particular section, we'll send you a post-survey if you would be kind enough to fill that out. And also a knowledge survey will be emailed to you following the second half of the training so that you can get your credits. So if you would take care of those housekeeping tasks after we're done, that would be much appreciated, and we can get you your credits. Okay, let's review our learning objectives from the last time so we kind of get our brains back in gear. It's been a whole month. So the learning objectives are the participants will be able to, first of all, define ethics. And we'll talk about that briefly again just to refresh your memories about that. Secondly, we talked about understanding the role of professional association and agency codes of ethics, and we looked at the fact that many professional associations, not just those related to counseling or psychology or even medicine, have professional codes of ethics. And certainly any of the counseling professions have those codes of ethics. And we talked about the importance of agencies and providers having their own codes of ethics as well that make it clear to employees what's expected of them, what kind of positive behavior they're expected to engage in, and what kind of negative behavior they're expected to avoid. So that's important if you don't have one of those agency codes of ethics, that you give that some serious thought. We took a little bit of look at the relationship between ethics and the law, and we know that the laws are very important. They govern the way societies can proceed in an orderly fashion. However, we've also considered the fact that some laws in the past, in history, have been unethical, and at times in those situations the demands of ethics moves people to act in a way that's contrary to the law. Those are very serious decisions when people decide to do that, and they have consequences, sometimes legal consequences, but people who have made those kinds of serious ethical decisions are willing to accept the legal consequences of their decision. So ethics and the law are not the same thing. We hope that our laws are ethical and promote ethical behavior, but sometimes that isn't the case. And many laws, of course, are just for the good order of society and don't get into the ethics area particularly much. Generally speaking, we should obey the law. We're going to look at understanding and appreciating the importance of professional boundaries. And I think this is a key area we'll spend some time on so that we understand how essential it is to have good professional boundaries in place. Then we're going to demonstrate the knowledge of federal, state, and agency regulations regarding confidentiality. We know this is a big issue now, today especially. There seems to be more information available about all of us that's readily available. Some of us participate in this willingly, put up our Facebook pages, etc. Nevertheless, there are confidentiality regulations that we need to be familiar with, especially when we're dealing with the population that we treat in addiction treatment centers. Okay, so let's review what we mean by ethics. Last time we said ethics refers to standards of behavior that tell us how human beings ought to act in their various personal and professional roles. Now you can see by this very definition that it's not rigid, that it does allow for us to use our minds and to figure out how to behave in certain situations. But the fact is that these standards will guide us, that ethical standards guide us as we make decisions in our personal and professional roles. And this is very important. Sometimes these roles overlap a bit. For instance, if you're a drug and alcohol counselor and you're arrested for drunk driving, and that appears in the newspaper, I think it's clear to say that although that was a personal decision that happened when you weren't at work, that you've compromised yourself in some serious way and that there would be serious consequences as a result. So even though you don't have a public role per se, your actions in public may have caused it to be difficult for you to perform your professional role, and therefore that needs to be avoided. So there can be overlaps between personal and professional. There's a lot in the news today about public figures, be they people in Congress or sports figures, who may do things in their personal lives that make it more difficult for them to fulfill their professional roles. So it's not simply an excuse to say, hey, what I do in my personal life is nobody's business. It's nobody's business unless it becomes people's business. And if it becomes public and has an impact on others around you, then it does impact your professional role as well. So ethics then gives us standards to help us shape our behavior both personally and professionally in a way that makes it possible to us to function both in our personal lives and our professional lives. Okay, let's go way back to 200 BC and consider for a minute the elements of what's been known as the Hippocratic Oath. This is the healthcare ethics based on the Hippocratic school. This isn't the Hippocratic school, that's a different school. There's a lot of that going around lately too. This is the Hippocratic school. And these are the principles that Hippocrates wanted his fellow physicians and healthcare givers of the time to keep in mind as they were dealing with people. The first is autonomy. This just recognizes the fact that people are individuals who have rights in and of themselves. And they're not just pawns on a chessboard that can be moved around. We have to recognize that people are autonomous and they can make decisions for themselves. They can listen to guidance, they can listen to information, they can consider all kinds of factors, but in the end people have the right to make decisions for themselves. Also, respect for persons. This is very essential, I think, throughout healthcare, is that we respect people, that we don't judge or condemn them as healthcare providers. A number of years ago, I think this was really underscored in the AIDS epidemic. You know, some people took a very crass view of people who had AIDS. Well, that doesn't really fit the Hippocratic school at all. We're here to help people who have difficulties in their lives, and medical professionals the same way. We're not here to judge. We have no idea how people got into the difficulties maybe they got into until we have a chance to talk to them and help them find a way out. But it's not up to us to judge them. We respect them as people, and we're here to provide assistance if possible. Confidentiality is very important, not just in the addiction treatment and recovery area, but really throughout healthcare. People have to have an understanding that what they're telling the healthcare provider is something that is going to remain between them. And we'll talk later about some of the subtleties and nuances around when that confidentiality, where the limits are with that. But in general, people need to feel like this is something that's going to remain between them and their healthcare provider. Truth-telling is an obligation really on both sides. The patient or the person coming in for help really does have an obligation to be truthful, but so does the caregiver in telling things that need to be told in a straightforward manner, in a way that's truthful. Non-malfeasance gets into that, what we usually think of when we think of the Hippocratic Oath, which is first do no harm, and that certainly is a good guidepost. We don't want to harm the people that are coming to us, so we have to be careful not to do that. Beneficence is the other side of that coin. We actually want to do them good. We want to do them something that's positive, so we need to be conscious of that as well. So that brings us back to 200 BC, advice from 200 BC, which is still, I think, very current today, and informs a lot of the thinking that we do around ethics in health care. Okay, let's talk for a minute about our patients, the people who come to us for help. Some people call them clients, others call them our patients, and that's the term I tend to use. So the first thing about our patients that we have to remember is they are not well. And that seems to be obvious, but I think that we really have to consider that people who come in for treatment for addiction or mental health services or anybody who's a patient, they come because they're in distress. And they come bearing their own symptoms. And therefore, we really need to work our hardest at keeping them involved in treatment and not letting them slip away or being too quick to discharge them from treatment. I met a young man just this past weekend up in Buffalo. I was in Buffalo doing some work for the ATTC up there. And I was talking to a young man who was the admissions director at a facility near the Pennsylvania-New York border. And he one day realized that their administrative discharge rate was too high. And he thought, well, these people that are coming to us, they need help. Why are we discharging them administratively, meaning they're kind of kicked out of treatment because of staff decision to do so? And so he got his team together, and they looked very closely at this. And they discovered that they had a 9% administrative discharge rate, and that they felt that that was not acceptable. And so they worked very hard in various ways to get that rate down, because they understood that their patients weren't well, that they were going to have problems, that they might do things or break rules, and that we can't be too quick to send people out of treatment. And after some hard work, in a period of 2 years, they reduced that rate from 9% administrative discharge rate to 2%. And that was a real triumph, I think, for that agency and a recognition of the condition of their patients. Next, our patients see us as powerful, because after all, anybody who isn't feeling well, and we can use that in the most general sense, and is coming in for help, sees the person or the agency or the people that are going to be helping them as powerful people, people who have a chance to do them good or do them harm. If we have people that are referred to us by the courts, for instance, they may see us as powerful in the sense that we can do them harm. And we may have to work with them for quite a while before they understand that we can do them good as well. Also, our patients are vulnerable. People who are having difficulties, whether they're physical, mental, emotional difficulties, or difficulties with addiction, are in a vulnerable state. They're not operating at the top of their game. So we need to be conscious of this and to be careful to respect that vulnerability. And of course, our patients have rights. Again, we're not the final arbiter in every instance as to what they need to be doing. We have to respect their rights. We have to give them the rights. We have to give those rights to them freely and without restraint. And of course, we have to understand this, that our patients can and do improve their lives. And all of us, I'm sure all of you that are tuned in here to this webinar today, have many examples of people that you worked with, some of whom you may have thought, these people don't really have a chance here. They have so much going against them, or they've made such really bad decisions in their lives. And then all of a sudden their lives begin to improve. They begin to make better decisions. They begin to come out of the fog, and their lives can improve. We have to believe this. We have to help our patients to believe this as well. Okay, we talked last time briefly about the continuum of professional behavior and what we're aiming at. When I think we're interacting with our patients, we're aiming at the therapeutic zone. Where can we be most helpful in that area between under-involvement, where we're not spending enough time or effort or energy dealing with our patients, or over-involvement? We'll talk more about that later. So we're aiming for the therapeutic zone, which brings us to a discussion of maintaining good professional boundaries. You know, it has been said that good fences make good neighbors. Well, I think in our profession, maintaining good professional boundaries helps keep our relationships with the patients healthy. And that's really, getting back to the Hippocratic Oath and the Hippocratic School, that's really important. It helps us to first do no harm and to keep a relationship healthy. And so we're going to take a look at what I call the 11 principles of maintaining good professional boundaries. I'm not quite sure why there's 11. I think it's somewhere because it falls between the 10 Commandments and the 12 steps of AA and NA. So I thought maybe 11 was available. So that's why there's 11. No more profound reason than that. There probably could be 15, 20, 6, I don't know. But here's the ones I think are important. First of all, you're going to plan your interventions with the goal of meeting the therapeutic needs of the patient. Now that seems pretty self-obvious when you look at it. But there's a couple words I think we need to focus on there. First of all, you need to plan. You need to do some thinking. You need to do some strategizing about what kind of interactions you're going to use as a professional, what kind of interventions that you're going to employ. And the goal needs to be meeting and understanding the therapeutic needs of the patient. And this gets us right to number 2, which is, these two kind of go together, which is be aware of your own needs, values, and attitudes in a professional relationship. Now, the fact of the matter is that all of us as human beings have our own needs. We certainly have our own set of values, and we have attitudes about things. And in some respects, these can be static. These can get in the way of us focusing on the therapeutic needs of the patient. We may, quote unquote, want certain things for our patient that the patient really isn't interested in pursuing. And we can end up essentially frustrating a patient or driving them out of treatment because we're focusing more on our needs and our values than what their therapeutic needs are. So these two things have to be balanced out. You certainly can't violate your own values in a relationship, a professional relationship. But you have to be aware that the patient needs to be the guider of what the goals and objectives are going to be. What is it that we can develop with the patient that's going to improve their lives from their perspective? Now, obviously, we have input into that as professionals, and our input is very important. But in the end, we need to be careful that we don't make our needs and values the center of the discussion and debate, and that we lose sight of the fact that the patient themselves, in their setting, in their situation, in their whatever hand life has dealt them, that they have certain situations to deal with, and we need to try as much as possible to adapt to their needs and concerns. So be careful about this and be aware. It's also important, I think, for you to take an inventory of your own needs and values, and so you understand how these may affect the way you interact with patients. And on any given day, your needs could change. If you get up in the morning and it's very disruptive, the alarm went off late, and then you had to run in and get the kids out of bed and get them off to school, and you forgot to pack your lunch, and when you get out to the car, you notice the tank is on empty, and you finally get into work, you're going to be in a different state of mind than if you got up, did a little yoga, had a little meditation, got yourself prepared, and get into work smiling and feeling totally unhassled. So be aware of all that, and the fact that as a professional you have to have some control of those things so that you can focus on the therapeutic needs of the patient. Number 3 may also seem self-obvious, and that's dress and speak in a manner appropriate to your professional role. I think it's important, whether you work for an agency or certainly if you're in private practice or whatever, you have different work settings. You may work with adolescents, you may work with adults, you may work with children. You may have to dress in certain ways if you're doing, for instance, a stint on an adventure-based counseling course. You're not going to wear a tie and jacket if you're out there on a ropes course climbing on things. But in general, you need to dress and speak in a manner that's appropriate to your professional role. I think the rule of thumb is that you should be able to meet and greet any patient who walks through the door. So that means you need to be dressed in a way that if a patient comes in after work from an office job, that they look at you and say, okay, this is a professional. Or if someone else comes in more informally dressed, they have the same impression. So I usually tell people to dress up a little bit rather than dressing down. And in terms of speaking, and watching your language. Again, this could seem self-evident, but I know in the very earliest days of addiction treatment, for instance, at times language could get a little salty, and there was a sense that well, I need to get down kind of to the level of the patient, and so I can meet them eye to eye. And I'm thinking, well, no, you don't need to get down to that level, because the patients are actually trying to get up from that level. So that you need to be cautious in the way you speak, in terms of speaking in a respectful manner at all time, and making sure that your language is appropriate for anyone to hear. I always say, speak like you think your mother might be listening to you, and then you know that your language is okay. Okay, the next one, number 4, limit self-disclosure. If you do reveal personal information, make sure it has therapeutic value for the patient. And this is very important, I think. This can be especially important for people who are in recovery from addiction themselves, who may now be working as counselors. Your own personal experience in recovery can be a very important and potent tool in your ability to counsel others who have a problem similar to yours. But it's also a tool that should be used sparingly, and should only be used after a judgment has been made that it has real therapeutic value for the patient. Because after all, it's not your recovery that really is at issue here, it's the patient's recovery. And often, patients get into recovery differently than their counselors do. This can be sometimes a point of frustration for counselors who have found very successful methods for themselves to get into recovery, and they're anxious to convey these to a patient who may not really be open to hearing those particular paths to recovery. So again, as a professional now, our job is to understand how we can make recovery happen for the patient, not necessarily how we made it happen for ourselves if we are in recovery. If you're not in recovery and have other life instances that may be relevant for the patient at certain times, it may be appropriate to disclose those. But I always think this is a tool that should be used sparingly, and it should be used in a directed and targeted way that meets the therapeutic needs, again, of the patient, and isn't simply us talking about ourselves. Because a lot of times patients are happy to have us talk about ourselves, and they don't have to talk about themselves. And the point is, we need to keep the focus on the patient. So be careful about self-disclosure. Make sure it's appropriate. Make sure you've thought it through as to why you're using self-disclosure at this particular point in the counseling relationship. And if you need to err on any side, err on the side of not disclosing rather than disclosing. But if you've determined that it can be effective, that it can encourage the client at this particular point, maybe that it's a very difficult time for them, something that might offer them support, something that might give them a sense of relief because now they're talking to somebody who has been through what they've been through, by all means go ahead and use self-disclosure, but limit it as much as possible. Okay, number 5. A blur, there's a new word, I made that up. Avoid blurring boundaries by saying or doing things that could be misinterpreted by patients and or others. And this gets into an area, I think, that we need to be cautious of. There is a fine line, especially if you work, for instance, in a group home setting or a setting where you're around patients like every day. They either come in every day or they're actually living in your facility, where things can tend to become a little more informal. You can begin almost to have a friendly relationship with the patients in your care, but it's still important to avoid blurring the boundaries and understanding whether certain behavior is appropriate or not appropriate in behalf of the patient. This can even apply to things like giving a patient a hug. Now, in years past, I think there was a lot of hugging and stuff that went on. There can be a role, I think, for physical contact. But I would say be very, very cautious about this for a number of reasons. First of all, unless you're very familiar with a patient's past and the experience they've had in their lives, they may have been victimized at some point. They may have been in some kind of domestic violence relationships or other kinds of relationships where they were exploited. and maybe physical touch isn't really what they're looking for or interested in. Even saying, "Can I give you a hug?" might be startling to them, and they say, "Okay, yeah, you can," but maybe they mean they really would not prefer to have a hug. So I think you have to be careful about physical contact with patients. You can be warm and welcoming verbally, I think, to people, in your tone of voice, in your own body language, but be careful about physical contact and really think it through. If physical contact does take place, make very certain that it's okay with the patient. Also, saying things to patients. As I say, if you have a familiar relationship with patients because you're around them every day and you like to kid around or joke around or even use nicknames and things like that, just be cautious about that, because there again, you don't know the patient's background entirely and whether they're totally comfortable. Until you have a sense of their comfort level, I would say go cautiously so that you avoid being misinterpreted by the patients or other people who might be around. Okay, number 6. And this is an important one. We need to react to patients' symptomatic behavior in a professional manner. We need to avoid punitive responses while holding the patient responsible for his or her words and behavior. Now, here's the thing about our patients. They have a right to their symptoms. Any of us who have any disorder, whether it be physical, mental, or in relation to addiction, we are going to have symptoms related to that disorder. And in a way, we have a right to those. Maybe I'm using too strong a word, but I think that you can expect that people are going to act symptomatically. And as professionals, we need to develop a kind of a tolerance of this behavior. I often use an example of an incident that happened on a detox unit at an agency or a facility that I worked at a number of years ago. And detox units, as you know, can be very difficult places to work. Patients are coming in, they're not feeling well at all physically. Detox is a difficult thing to do. Whatever your particular feelings about patients in detox are, the fact of the matter is that detox patients are often in great physical discomfort. They're anxious. They have mood swings as they're trying to get off their drug of choice in a detox center. Well, one day in the detox center, a patient kept coming up to the nurse on duty, and he kept wanting his medication early. He was insisting that he was feeling badly and he couldn't wait till 3 o'clock for his medication. It was only 1 o'clock, but he wanted his 3 o'clock medication. And the nurse, the first couple of times, said, "No, we can't do that. I have to follow the orders here. We can only give you your medication when it's assigned." So then the patient got very agitated and started to yell at the nurse. And finally, when the nurse was persistent about not giving the medication, he looks the nurse in the eye and he says, "Well, bleep you." And the nurse looks him back in the eye and says, "Well, bleep you too." Now, see, this was not a good response. See, the patient, we need to expect that the patients are going to act symptomatically. Now, the nurse could have said, by avoiding punitive responses and holding the patient responsible for his or her words and behavior, could have said, "Look, you're upset right now. We can't have that kind of language out here in public, so you need to calm down, and when you're calmer, come back and we'll talk this thing through and we'll see what we can do." Or some response like that. Now, the fact of the matter is we're all human beings, and occasionally we may do something we regret, and we can talk to our supervisor about it later. We don't need to get defensive about it. But the fact of the matter is we need to be careful and understand that our patients are going to act symptomatically. I've been called a lot of things in my day on the phone and in person, and everything from somebody wishing I dropped dead right there to being called something I won't repeat here on the webinar. But my stance has always been to invoke the sentiments expressed in, and I can say this because I'm an Italian American, the sentiments expressed in that old mafia saying, "This isn't personal, it's business." And I think we have to keep that in mind. When our patients are going off at us, no matter how personal their comments may seem, when we have our professional hats on and we're in a professional setting, it's not personal for us. It's business. It's professional, and we respond in a professional manner. Heck, if our kids talk that way to us or something like that, that might be different. But when you're dealing with our population in a professional setting, then we have to depersonalize it and understand that we need to be in control of our personal feelings and react to things in a professional manner. So please keep that in mind when patients get a little symptomatic on you. It's time for us to ratchet down, not ratchet up. It's time for us to de-escalate, not escalate. And I think that becomes very important in dealing with our patient population. And that can be very effective because people, when we're de-escalating, they tend to de-escalate along with us. If we start to escalate, then they're going to escalate along with us as well. So just be aware of that and to act professionally in those kinds of situations when the patients are acting on their symptoms. Okay, more. Number 7. Spend the amount of time and effort with each patient that is clinically indicated. We talked about this earlier. You can determine clinically the amount of time and effort and attention the patient needs from you as the clinician or the caregiver. And this is a clinical decision if you want to stay within the bounds of ethics. In other words, if you decide, if you're an outpatient counselor, for instance, and somebody is coming in to see you weekly, and after a clinical assessment, for whatever reason, it's determined that coming in every other week or even monthly is okay at this point, that should be a clinical decision and not one that's based on the fact that you don't like this client very much. It's hard enough for you to see them when they come in, so you don't want to see them you don't want to see them weekly. You want to see them biweekly or monthly. That wouldn't be clinical. That would be making the decision based on a personal reaction. So it's okay to adjust people up or down in terms of your clinical contact with them, but it needs to be made entirely based on clinical reasons. And often the way to test this out the best, if there's any ambivalence on your part, is to talk it over with your supervisor or even another colleague if your supervisor isn't available, to make sure that you're thinking correctly about the amount of time and effort you're spending with this particular patient. Because you want to find, again, that therapeutic zone and spending the amount of time and effort that's appropriate for the patient. Number 8, apply the structure of the treatment plan. Good treatment plans make for good boundaries. Now, I am a big believer in treatment plans. I think if we approach patients with a plan in mind that they certainly have had a lot of input in developing, then we have a structure. And most patients, especially addiction patients, need structure in their lives. I often think of the word that's applied to a lot of treatment centers around the country who deal with addiction. They're called rehab centers. And when we think about rehab, if you think about rehabbing a kind of an old building somewhere, you'll notice that a lot of time what happens is that the rehabbers move in with a structure, an external structure. They build a scaffolding around the building because they're going to be doing work on the structure of the building, maybe shoring up the bricks, repointing them, or recaulking things, getting the windows back in shape, doing some painting. So they put that external structure up around the building until the building is, quote unquote, strong enough and sound enough to stand on its own. And so I think that structure, which is provided by the treatment plan, is very helpful to patients who are feeling that their lives are spinning out of control, that they're chaotic, that they don't know where the end of the ball of yarn is. And by having a structure in place, a good treatment plan, then I think that that's a good start on the way toward recovery. I remember a patient we had once, again at the treatment facility where I worked for many years, and we were doing a focus group, and this woman had come into treatment probably 15 years before, and she was a street addict, literally living under the bridge. She was a heroin addict. Her life really was completely shot, and she came to our facility, went through the program, and it was very successful for her, and she had 15 years of clean time and sobriety, and her life had completely turned around. She was a very responsible citizen, and in many ways, both professionally and in her personal life. And so I remember asking her, I said, what did it for you? What was about your stay here at this treatment facility? What really helped you? And I thought her answer was somewhat revealing. She really didn't talk about the therapy very much or what happened to her clinically. What she said was, well, this was the first place I had ever been where I had to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I had to make my bed, and I had to be down at breakfast at a certain time, and I had to be in group therapy by 10. And then I had these assignments I had to work on and finish and hand in to the therapist. And then there was the lectures. And so she was basically describing the program schedule. And it reminded me that how important structure can be for people that have not experienced much structure in their lives, and how that woman was able to start with that experience, very basic, like I said, almost like finding the edge, the end of the ball of yarn, and then begin to really weave a very beautiful life that she wove as a result of her recovery. So I think structure is important, and treatment plans are very important in maintaining that structure. Good treatment plans also make for good boundaries. It helps us to focus our clinical interventions with patients. It helps them to understand where they're going. It becomes a roadmap. They can be encouraged as certain things happen that are in the treatment plan, that they accomplish certain goals that are outlined in the treatment plan. And I think then this encouragement and this feeling of accomplishment then, which is concrete because you can kind of look at it and almost check it off on the treatment plan, gives people the sense of, hey, I can take control of my life. I can take small steps toward recovery. And those small steps then eventually become a great journey, a great life journey, which can be quite impressive, and the patient then begins to experience what recovery is all about. So make sure you apply that good structure of the treatment plans and spend some time writing good treatment plans. Okay, now number 9 is respect patient confidentiality formally and informally. We're going to talk a little bit about formal confidentiality in a few minutes. And I'd certainly like to spend some time on that. Am I getting some questions here? No, okay. I see some questions over there, but they're procedural things. Okay, so let's talk about formal and informal patient confidentiality. As I said, in a few minutes we're going to talk about formal confidentiality. So here we're going to focus a little bit on informal confidentiality. And this has to do with being careful, if you work in a provider agency, for instance, about what you do with written information that may be of a confidential nature. Where you might leave it lying around where it could be seen. Maybe you go into a restroom and you have like your sheet with treatment plans or progress notes, and you lay it down, and then on your way out you forget to bring it with you, and now it's out there in the restroom for people to see. Or you're talking about confidential information on a phone in your office, and your speakerphone is on and your door is open and people walking by can hear that conversation. Or you may be out to lunch with some colleagues and you're talking about patients and giving information about patients. You may not be naming them per se, but you don't know who's sitting around that might recognize what you're talking about. And you can do this even innocently. Another story from my treatment center days, and I don't want to give the impression that this treatment center I worked at, just bad things happened there, but I was there for 25 years, and there are many, many good stories, mostly 90% good stories I could tell you, but for the purposes of this instruction, I have a couple of examples that maybe aren't so good. And in one instance, what happened was a person who was working in kind of a back office department, didn't really have direct contact with patients, noticed one day, just from processing some information, that a young woman came into treatment from her neighborhood. Actually, she was happy to see this because this young woman was a little bit notorious, and everybody in the neighborhood kind of knew she had some problems. And so this employee's first reaction was, well, this is good. She's getting into treatment. She's finally getting some help. Now, the problem was when she went home and was talking over the back fence, I guess, with another neighbor, she mentioned this to her. She said, you'll never guess who came into the treatment center. And she mentioned this young woman's name. And so, the other woman, as I say, was aware that she was probably having problems. But what happened was, about a year later, someone came in for an intake evaluation, a pre-intake evaluation, and they talked to the evaluation specialist, and the evaluation specialist said, I think that you need to come into this treatment center, this inpatient level of care here at the treatment center. And the woman said, you know what, I don't think I can do that. And the evaluation specialist said, well, why not? And the woman recounted this story. She was the neighbor who the other employee had told about the young woman being admitted to treatment. And so she said to the evaluation specialist, I don't think this place is very confidential, and I wouldn't be comfortable coming here if I felt like people were going to talk about me and the fact that I'm here. And so that was an innocent kind of thing that the employee did. She certainly meant no harm, but you can see that because it was an informal breach of confidentiality, it did cause some harm. And so we have to be careful about confidentiality on an informal basis. Now, number 10 gets a little dramatic at times, but it's do not engage in any type of dual relationship with patients, including personal, business, financial, romantic, and sexual relationships. And I always like to be clear here and say it is not a good idea to have sex with your patients. And I say that because this at times can be a problem in professions. There was a study done a while back that said up to 40% of clinical psychologists had inappropriate romantic or sexual relationships with patients. Now, I don't know how true that is, but I do know it can be a problem because when you're counseling people, that can be an intimate environment. You're hearing personal things. Your sympathies are being engaged. There's transference and countertransference going on. So we have to be careful, certainly, about romantic and sexual relationships of any type, avoiding them at all costs, and being very open in supervision if we are feeling that romantic feelings or any kind of sexual feelings are coming up in the counseling relationship. The best thing to do is to bring that out into the open very early with a supervisor, determine whether you can even continue working with the patient or not, and if you can't, then don't. But don't wait until very late in a counseling relationship when it may be too late, and serious consequences will ensue, both for the patient especially, but also for you as well as the caregiver. So avoid romantic and sexual relationships of any type. The personal, business, and financial are also important. We should not engage, especially, let's focus on business for a minute. It can be you may think it's even, well, here's a person, they're struggling, they have a particular business, I need a particular type of work done. We once had a therapist who, this patient had been out of treatment for a year, but he was a roofer, and she needed some roofing done, and she employed this person to be her roofer. Well, it turned out he wasn't a very good roofer, and she had difficulties, in terms of his meeting his obligations as a roofer. But now that became a dual relationship because this person would not come back to the treatment center if he needed help again, knowing that this particular person was employed there. So you have to be careful. One time, one of a patient that I was involved in, not personally as the counselor, but as the supervisor of the counselor, had an asphalt business, and I needed my driveway done, and he was passing out his cards, which was fine, and I looked at it, and for a moment I thought, it'd be nice to give this guy some business, and then I remembered the roofer story and said, maybe not, and so I just let it pass and found myself another person. Now, it could also be that you will have an agreement, say, with a contractor, and you'll come into your house and you'll discover that here was a patient who's working for the contractor, and you didn't know anything about that. He's just an employee of the contractor. I wouldn't react too vigorously to that. I would just keep that information cool. He might be as startled to see you as you were to see him. And as long as things are going well, and if there are any problems, you wouldn't be dealing directly with the worker. You'd be dealing with the contractor anyway. So that one's maybe a little stickier. But avoid business relationships. Don't lend money to patients or borrow money from patients. nothing like that. In personal relationships also avoid those as well. Okay. Number 11, of course, is discuss any concerns you have about boundary issues with your supervisor early and often. And I want to stress early. If you're having boundary issues, if you talk about it sooner rather than later, that's better. You get them out there and into the light of day. Don't be alarmed or ashamed to have boundary issues. We're human beings, and it can happen to us. And they don't always have to be romantic and sexual. I mean, for instance, if your father or mother was an alcoholic, say, and someone comes into treatment and reminds you of your parent, your alcoholic parent, and that either evokes a great deal of sympathy, you kind of get into your child of alcoholic stance, and you find yourself wanting to spend lots of time and lots of intervention with this person, or the opposite, you had such a terrible experience with your parent that you're putting your resentments off on the patient. That can be a boundary issue. Those kinds of things are important to talk through in supervision, and hopefully your supervisor, also understanding the situation, is understanding of those kinds of conversations. All of us are going to have human reactions, and good supervision helps us to modulate our human reactions so that we can maintain our professional demeanor when we're dealing with patients. So use supervision early and often to maintain good professional boundaries. So those are the 11 commandments, or the 11 steps, or the 11 whatevers of maintaining good professional boundaries. Okay, we're going to move on to confidentiality now. We're going to start off with a case. So there's a question. Please accept my apology. I had to. Okay, so somebody's just joining us a little late, I think. Oh, cannot set up an online communication. Well, I hope you can hear us, even if you can't see us. Okay, we're going to talk now about confidentiality and the law. I thought we'd start off with this case and analyze this. And if any of you have any comments, you're welcome to call in or use the chat to type in your comments. And I'll certainly give you my comments. But sometimes it's hard to have a real genuine conversation in a format like this. I realize that, versus if we were all in a room together and had that kind of interaction. But we'll do the best we can. So here's a case for you to ponder with me. A court-ordered client comes to an appointment after skipping his previous session. His counselor tells him that if he misses another session, she will have to report him to his probation officer. At this, the client becomes extremely agitated. He tells her that if she does report him, it will be the last time she reports anybody. "I know when you get off work," he says, "and I can find out where you live, too." He then storms out of the agency. Here's some more. She consults with her supervisor, and they decide to call both the probation officer and the police immediately. When the police arrive at the agency to interview the counselor, she recounts the incident and says, "I'm really worried that this client will find me and harm me. He's admitted to being violent with his wife, although the authorities are not aware of this. And in order to get revenge on someone once, he cut the brake line on their car. Fortunately, the intended victim was not seriously injured in the resulting accident, and no one ever found out that my client had done this. I don't want to be his next victim." Okay. All right. Okay, now here are some things to consider. What are the ethical issues here? Has the counselor done the right thing? What about the supervisor? Okay, let's consider this case for a minute. And hopefully you're at least thinking with me, even if we're not able to talk. And as I say, if you have a comment, you can throw it up on the screen. I might have to squint a little bit to see it, but I can see it. And if you want to call in and you have a comment, a verbal comment, you can make that as well. But I'll give you my thinking on this. If you disagree and you're not comfortable interacting here now, you can email me later and we can have a little email conversation about this case if you want. Let's go back and take a look again. So this is a court-ordered client who comes in for an appointment. The first thing we want to look at is in the case study doesn't give us this information. How did the counselor really interact with this client about that information? You know, was she confrontive? What was her tone of voice? You know, did she try to explore with him? Did she start off by saying, it's good to see you this session. Sorry you had to miss the last one. I wonder why that happened. And then maybe give the client a chance to talk through what happened. Why did he miss that session? But if in fact she went directly to kind of a confrontive approach and said, I'm going to have to report you. This is your second session you missed, or the first session. You missed a session. If you missed another one, I'm going to have to report you to your probation officer. That may not have been the first kind of reaction you would want to have with a client that you knew was agitated and potentially violent. You may want to use some motivational interviewing techniques and get the client to talk more about what his situation was. But be that as it may, maybe she handled it completely correctly. This is just a case study. It doesn't list the whole conversation. This may have been kind of her final intervention when she wasn't getting any cooperation from the client at all. Now, she noticed then that the client became extremely agitated. And then he launches into, if she reports him, it'll be the last time, and I know where you live, and all of that kind of stuff, and storms out of the agency. Now, the first question we have to ask is, was it okay for the therapist or the counselor? Well, first of all, she did a good thing. She consulted with her supervisor. All right? It's always good when you're upset, and this would be upsetting for a female counselor or even a male counselor with an agitated patient, and we know from the rest of the case study that she knew a little bit of the history here. So instead of a knee-jerk reaction, she did consult with her supervisor, a good thing to do. Let me see if I'm thinking clearly about this. And they decided to call the probation officer and police immediately. So they took his threat seriously. Now, confidentiality law does allow you to report a crime committed on the premises of your agency. And so this was a terroristic threat. It was interpreted as a terroristic threat. I'm going to get you. I know where you live. Things like that. So at this point, it seems to me that she was within her rights to call the probation officer and the police and to report this. So I think we're okay, and we're in good legal grounds here with confidentiality so far. When the police arrive at the agency to interview the counselor, she recounts the incident. And she says she's really worried that this client will find me and harm me. Okay, she's good there. Now here's where we get into an area that maybe is a little trickier. She tells the police that he's admitted to being violent with his wife, although the authorities weren't aware of this, and then she recounts the incident of where he allegedly cut somebody who he was resentful of. He cut their brake line, and nobody ever found out about this, and she didn't want to be the next victim. Strictly speaking, according to the law, this was too much information to give to the police. We have to limit it to the reporting of the actual criminal behavior that occurred at the agency. We can't be bringing up other things we know because of the counseling relationship. Now, you can see why she did it. She was trying to impress on the police that, hey, this guy could do bad things. Because in counseling sessions, he's admitted to doing bad things in the past. She may have said something general like that she was concerned because of some of the things that he had done in the past, but even that might have been over the line. The main thing in this situation, I think, was she was on good ground as long as she just recounted the crime that was committed, the terroristic threats that were made on the site, and her level of deep concern and worry that she might be a victim of this guy. The police should have and probably would have read between the lines, even if she had said, I can't give you any more details about this case, but let me repeat, I'm really worried that I could become a victim here. And then they could have taken appropriate action. And that would have kept her within the limits of confidentiality. So the ethical issues here were not violating her client's confidentiality, which she appears to have first not done, and then possibly she did do. So she did the right thing in the beginning, but not so much as she went on. and using supervision was a very wise and good decision. She should certainly have done that, and she did that. That's my take on this case. If you have any other comments on that you want to let us know about, we'll be glad to hear them. And if not, we'll move on. We'll move on, and if you have any comments and they appear on the screen, I'll stop and take a look at them. And as I say, if you have any thoughts later, you can always email me. So let's talk then about confidentiality. Okay, first of all, it's simple. The identity of a patient in treatment for drug and alcohol problems must be kept confidential unless the patient gives informed written consent to release information. Okay, so it's that simple. Unless the patient gives consent, then the information has to be held in confidence. Okay, when does this start? Well, the protection begins with the first call to the agency to set up an appointment. So this is interesting. Okay, here's a comment from Elka Hanel. I would apply situational attribution rather than individual attribution in that case in order to allow the patient to calm down. Okay, very interesting. That might have helped in not escalating the situation. I would take the threat seriously, however. She clearly showed her fear, which increased the agitation of the client. Okay, that's actually, what I think Elka is saying there is certainly the first line of defense. You want to use your counseling skills to de-escalate a patient and try to resolve the agitation and maybe avoid getting into a situation where a volatile patient is going to make a threat. And that way you protect both the patient and yourself as a therapist. So that's a good comment. Thank you, Elka, for that comment. That is the whole comment, right? Okay, good. So situational attribution rather than individual attribution. Don't be blaming necessarily the patient themselves, but say, okay, what's the situation that caused this to occur? And that's often a way to de-escalate things. Make it, depersonalize it, make it more situational, focus on the situation, and see if that leads to de-escalation. You could see how there might have been a really, if the therapist was very skilled at that point in de-escalation, how this might have been a very fruitful session. You know, gotten the client to talk about their propensities to struggle with authority, or to do what other people ask them to do, or deal with their resentments about feeling trapped in the situation that they're in, even though whatever they did themselves caused them to be trapped. But there's a lot of good counseling that could have happened if this had been de-escalated. So thanks for that comment. Okay, back to confidentiality. It's simple. Number 2 was this protection begins with the first call to the agency to set up an appointment. So that means if the second call is from the wife of the person who just called in to make the appointment, to say, did my husband call to make an appointment there? That we really aren't at liberty to say that he did. So it begins at the beginning. Confidentiality, it's complex. So it's both simple and complex. Okay, there are types of consents. There are what information you can release and to whom you can release it. There are your agency may help you with this by developing a kind of a basket of consent forms that are appropriate for groups like employee assistance programs, insurance companies or funding sources, criminal justice system, just a general consent, employers, what you can release to employers, schools, all kinds of situations. Sometimes it's better to have specific consents designed to address each of those groups. What about managed care? This is a complex question because I know there are people in our audience today from many different states. In general, we resist giving managed care entities more information than they need. But in order for them to make their decision about whether or not a patient should stay in treatment, the federal law seems to allow you to give a fair amount of information to managed care companies while keeping in mind that you need to restrict the information as much as possible. And there may be some information that you will simply decide to hold back. Managed care companies are a tricky thing to deal with, or insurance companies. They are the payer, and on one level they have a right to know what they're paying for, whether the patient is making progress in treatment or not. whether the patient is coming to treatment sessions, whether they've relapsed, and what's being done about the relapse if they have relapsed. Things like that can be appropriate to share with a managed care company. Your state may have stricter laws. For those of you that are listening to me in Pennsylvania, we have among the strictest laws on the books around patient confidentiality. And we are simply not allowed to give managed care companies very much information at all. We can't tell them what medications they're taking. We can't even really tell them what the results of a drug screen were. We can say the patient has relapsed, but we can't say their drug screen came back positive for cocaine, things like that. So in Pennsylvania, the law is very strict. If in Pennsylvania we do have a little bit of a break here, if your patient is covered under Act 106, and about 50% of the patients in Pennsylvania who are covered by commercial insurance are covered by Act 106, then managed care has no standing at all. We don't have to get managed care permission to treat patients. That's decided by the referring physician or psychologist only. So check your state laws about how you interact with managed care companies. Again, the general principle on the federal level is that you can give managed care companies the information they need to make a decision about whether a patient should remain in treatment, but you should do this in a restrictive manner as possible. But your state may be even more restrictive as it is in Pennsylvania, and you should check state law to make sure about that. Medical emergencies are the one area where confidentiality kind of drops. If a patient of yours ends up in an emergency room and the emergency room calls and says, I need to know what drugs this person has been taking and I need to know how recently he's been taking, if you have any knowledge about how recently or the amounts he's been taking, you can give them that information. This is for the benefit of the patient, and this is another healthcare entity. And they need to know this information so that they don't make an error that could have very bad effects on the patient. So in medical emergencies, you have a pretty free hand. Subpoenas are interesting. Subpoenas are, generally speaking, if you get a subpoena that says, appear in court and bring the record because you're going to have to testify about this client. The fact of the matter is, according to the law, a subpoena is not sufficient. On the other hand, you can't ignore a subpoena. You can't just say, well, screw you, I'm not going in there. You have to respond, and your response should be literally, if possible, to the attorney that's subpoenaing you. Go ahead and copy out the parts of the law that talk about what has to be done before you can appear in court, and send it to the attorney and saying, while you can honor the subpoena, you can show up in court, and you should always do that. You shouldn't not show up in court. If the attorney says, I don't care, you have to show up in court, show up in court. But then you can have a conversation with the judge or whoever about what the law says you can release and can't release and how it has to be obtained. And the way it has to be obtained is through a court order. It's the judge who has to make the decision about whether the record needs to be brought into the case, whether it's relevant information or not. And the judge needs to be able to justify that. It just can't be, oh, let's see what's in that record. We might find something that's relevant. The judge has to make a determination that in this particular case, what's in the record is relevant and needs to be admitted as evidence in court, and therefore issues a court order. And in that case, then, the information can be released. So confidentiality is complex, as you can see. And it's not done being complex, because now we have duty to warn, and we'd have to do a whole webinar on duty to warn. So I can't talk a lot about that given time constraints. But what I would say about this is read up on it. Be careful that you understand what duty to warn really means. Usually this has to do with direct and very specific threats that are made to injure someone else, or if the client is going to injure themselves, that then we have a duty to warn a third party that this is going to happen. Obviously, if your client comes in and says, I just can't take it anymore, I have a gun out in the car and I'm going to go home and blow my wife away, you better be on the phone with the wife and letting her know that. and then you better be on the phone with the police to let her know that this happened, because you don't want to be the one who says, "Oh yeah, I knew this information, but I didn't take it seriously." On the other hand, patients will make kind of global statements. I once had this was happened when I was a student, and I was doing an internship many years ago, because I'm an old guy, and this was back in the 70s, in the mid-70s, and I was doing an internship at a rural community mental health center in Georgia. I was a student at the time at the University of Georgia. And I had and this was a rural center. I mean, out in front of this center was a horse hitch post where clients could actually come on horseback and hitch their, geez, I'm sounding older than I actually am here, I think. But actually, in that particular setting, it wasn't unusual for a client to arrive on horseback, although people did have cars. Let me hasten to add that as well for any of you that may be from Georgia. This was back in the 70s. But anyway, I had a patient was assigned to me. I was an intern, and he had schizophrenia, and I liked him, actually. He was a good patient in many ways. But one day he came in, and he was just angry about something. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "You know, sometimes I just get the feeling that I want to kill somebody." And I was hoping that he wasn't thinking of me at that time. But I talked immediately to my supervisor about that. We determined that this was not a duty to warn situation. I did probe, and I said, "Did you have anybody particular in mind? Are you angry at somebody in particular?" I asked some specific questions, and he didn't have answers to those. It was clear he was just kind of generally angry, and the only way he knew how to express it in kind of the way of the rural Georgia culture at that time was to say he just felt so agitated that he felt like he might want to kill somebody. And so we determined that there really was nobody specific to warn. There wasn't enough specificity there. And you really can't report that to the police because nobody's really been threatened. It was just an expression of anger. That was our determination in my conversation with the supervisor. And I'm happy to report that, to my knowledge, he never did kill anybody. So I'm happy to report that. So there has to be a level of specificity, and it is good to get some guidance from your supervisor because this can be unsettling. But you may have to act quickly in certain cases. So you may have to do some reading up on duty to warn. Okay, let's see what we have next here. Record-keeping follies. Okay, we're getting into the last portion of the talk here, so this is always fun to talk about record-keeping follies. And here's another case study for us to consider. You've been seeing a client for the past 6 months. You are 3 months behind in your documentation in the chart. The supervisor has announced that the funding agency is coming in for an audit on Monday, and she hopes everyone's charts are in order. Yipes. You come in on the weekend to update your chart. You know the client is scheduled every Thursday at 3 p.m., and you know in general what you've been talking about and working on in treatment. You kind of remember that he missed a session or two during those 3 months, but you can't remember which dates. So you decide to write a note for every Thursday he could have attended. Now, what's wrong with this picture? I guess I'll go back to the follies here. Again, you can think this over, and if you have a comment, you can do what Elka did and type it in, and we'll see it on the screen here, and I'll read it. But what we can see here is that this particular counselor had a fairly informal relationship with his records, with his charts. And here was a client he'd been seeing for the past 6 months, and he got 3 months behind in his documentation. And all of us know that the day of reckoning is going to come. The day when the state licensing authority is going to come on site, or the day when a funding authority may come on site to review charts for audits. And incidentally, in Pennsylvania, you folks, your charts are not protected from insurance companies or managed care companies coming in to do a chart audit. They do have the right to do that. So you're not off the hook there in Pennsylvania just because the confidentiality laws may be a little stricter. But So you know this day is coming, and so he took the approach of going in on a weekend, now trying to make up for his past sins, and just kind of making up some progress notes and slapping them in the record. There's a number of things here that could be problematic here. And we'll see them, I think, as we go through a little discussion of record keeping and its importance. And so maybe we'll use this case and we'll go through the things that I have following it, and we can refer back to this case as we go along. Okay, what's the purpose of record keeping? Well, it's to communicate patient progress in treatment. This is important. There should be enough information in the chart that if you go on vacation, or if you're sick and somebody has to cover for you that day at the last minute, they may be able to pick up the record, look in there, read the most recent progress notes, the treatment plans, understand what's going on, and be able then to have some interaction with the patient that will be important in keeping that patient on track in treatment. So communication is a real important aspect of record keeping. It can improve patient care by helping the clinician think logically about a case. I think sometimes we underestimate this. It's really good to think about sessions after they occur. What happened in that session? Was it something that was significant? Did significant work? Was significant work done there? Where do we need to go next with this case? And by pausing and thinking and making a few notes, this helps the clinician to think logically about a case. It also reflects the competence of the caregiver. If you write a good note, and I've seen some really good notes in my day. Let me say something complimentary about that treatment center that I've been disrespecting this past hour. I saw some really excellent record keeping when I would review records internally, where in some of the notes were longer, but some were brief and concise. And it's okay to be brief and concise. It's okay. I used to tell people it's okay to write bullets as long as the bullet points reflect real information. That's important information. And so it's not the length of the note that's important. It's what the note says. Okay, Elka says once again that approach seems to be pretty unprofessional with regard to the way the person approached the record keeping. And I would certainly endorse that and say that that's very, very true. And the use of the word unprofessional, I think, is well advised. Again, if you're a professional, you take care of the things you need to take care of. And record keeping, while it's not something any of us love to do, keep those records up to date, it is important to do that. And I'll defer again, say another nice thing about that treatment center that I worked at. One time I was visiting one of our outpatient clinics, and it was 6:30 in the evening, and I noticed the daytime partial hospitalization therapist was still there. And so I said to her, "Amanda, are you on the night shift tonight?" And she said, "No, I'm on the paperwork shift," which meant that even though her day technically ended at 5 o'clock, she wasn't done with her paperwork. She wasn't going to go home until her notes were in the record, and that was acting professionally. She was acting very professionally there. Okay, back to our purposes for record keeping. We talked about reflecting the competence of the caregiver. It helps funding groups verify that what they are paying for in treatment is actually occurring, and that is important. They have a right. And incidentally, you can develop a good relationship with a funding body even if you don't give them a lot of information when they do the managed care call. If they come in and review their records and say, "This organization is on the up and up. I'm seeing here in these records that I review that real treatment is actually taking place, that this is worth paying for." And so when they go back to review your cases one by one on the phone, they may trust you more. They may determine that, that organization, when we go in to do our audits, they're always up to snuff. We don't need to get a whole lot of information for them. We can trust them. And so it really sets up a relationship of trust with a funder, and that can pay off down the road. And literally, and no pun intended, but literally it can pay off, and it can certainly pay off in other ways. It also serves as a legal record of treatment activities. So all of these things are why record keeping is done. Let's talk for a minute about the ethics, and then we can refer back to our case a little bit. Do the required documentation in a timely fashion. This is where our counselor initially tripped up. He didn't do his documentation in a timely fashion. He has a professional responsibility, getting back to the comment made earlier, he has a professional responsibility to figure out how to do this. If he gets behind, he has a professional responsibility to go to his supervisor and say, I'm a little bit behind in my paperwork. Is there something we can work out? Well, I'll have some extra time this afternoon or this morning or this evening, whenever they're working, when I can spend some time focusing on my documentation. If he feels like he's behind a day or so. But don't wait weeks, months, because then you get into a situation like he did, where he acted unethically, where he essentially made stuff up and put it in the record. Not even knowing that the client may have missed a few sessions, but saying, I don't know which one, so I'm just going to write a note for every Thursday and hope for the best. That's not ethical behavior. So do the required documentation in a timely fashion. You should never let let me just say, you should never let the sun go down on your records if possible. Now, if it is impossible, you have to do it the next morning or the next day. There may be instances of that. But the best rule of thumb is never let that sun go down. Do the documentation as close to the event as you possibly can. I understand this isn't always possible. You may intend to do this. You've just had a session. You intend to write the note. Your phone rings. There's a crisis occurring with one of your other clients. You have to get to that crisis immediately. And so you're going to have to get back to doing that note a little bit later. But do it as close as you can to the time that the actual event occurred. Ensure that the documentation is individualized and distinguishes one patient from another. It's not okay to have canned documentation where you just kind of run it off on your copier and stick it in the chart. You have to show that you're paying individual attention to this person and their individual problems. And you can do that by making sure that the documentation records the treatment event accurately in terms of time and content, and is concise and discrete. And this is one that I really wanted to get to, that the treatment plan should relate to the assessment information and the progress notes should relate to the treatment plans. So that really goes back really to number 2 there. If you're documenting to the treatment plan and you're making sure that your notes relate to what you and the patient agreed to on the treatment plan and to the assessment information that you obtained, which was used to develop the treatment plan, then you're going to meet the requirements of number 2, which is to ensure the documentation is individualized and distinguishes one patient from another, and you'll be in good shape. Making sure that the documentation records the treatment event accurately in terms of time and content, but be concise and discrete. Let me just say a few words about this. It is important to follow your agency regulations, or if you're in private practice, to make sure you record the time that you wrote the progress note. And you may also refer in the body of the note to when the session occurred, if you know that was not pretty much contiguous to when you're writing the note. But you want to know when the note was written. It's important if others pick up the chart to know when the note was written so that they can make some judgments in terms of later events that might have occurred in treatment. You want it to accurately record the content of the session. So it should be something that's really focused on what happened in the session. And I always caution people to be concise, so you don't have to go on and on and on and on and on. You can be concise, it could be brief, and to be discreet. These are records that could have other people looking at them, so you don't want to go into the goriest details of every case. You want to say just enough to cover the subject, but not enough that it gets turned into a TV movie. You don't want to provide so much detail that if that record were ever pulled into the public light, the information in there that might be hurtful to the client would come to light. So enough information to reflect the content and the progress that you're making in treatment in relation to what you agreed to do on the treatment plan, but be concise and be discreet as well. Okay. Avoid pretending to keep a record. For example, backdating and guessing. That's what our poor unfortunate counselor did in the case that we started out with. He was really doing pretend record keeping. He wasn't doing real record keeping. There can be no backdating. If you sit down to do a progress note even the day after the event occurred, you have to date it that day. You can't date it the day before you actually are writing the note. You shouldn't just be guessing about information. It should be information that you're aware that happened in the session, and you should be faithful to that. Okay, let's see. Okay, all right. So that's all we're going to say about record keeping. I think it's important to reflect on that in an ethical context. Okay, let's talk about now stepping back. Let's take a step back into the pure ethos of ethics and talk about what goes into making good ethical decisions. And we're coming to the end here for some of you that are saying, when's this guy going to end? We're coming up shortly to the end. Okay, the first thing you want to do is you want to learn to recognize what really are ethical issues. And you're going to ask yourself some questions. You're going to say, could the decision or situation be damaging to someone or to some group? So is this a situation that could cause damage somewhere? That's something you want to consider when making a good ethical decision. Does the decision involve a choice between a good and a bad alternative, or perhaps between two goods or between kind of two bad alternatives? That's important to assess. Sometimes, hey, this is clearly the way to go, you know. Maybe this is a controversial thing to say, but I happen to be reading the biography of Harry Truman. I'm at the part where he's deciding whether or not to drop the atomic bomb. Now, there's an ethical decision if you ever heard of one. In retrospect now, these many years later, when we see how destructive atomic weaponry is, and we really understand how it keeps the world on edge, and now we're in a situation where if some terrorist gets hold of some ability to make an atomic weapon, what a terrible thing this would be. We probably have the perspective of history. At the time, I think what Truman and the others who were to make this decision were looking at was two bad things. Truman himself believed that the atomic bomb was kind of a bad weapon. He called it a bad weapon. But he was very pleased that we had it. And, he didn't make any bones about that. And the ethical dilemma, I think, for he and those decision makers was, what are we going to say to the American people if the war in Japan goes on for another year and we lose? Low estimates were that there would be probably 250,000 American troops lost in an invasion of Japan. What was he going to say to the American people if he had to say, we had this weapon that might have ended the war, but instead we decided to send 250,000 American troops to their death? And so and even though that may seem like a no-brainer, it isn't such a no-brainer, because many, many people died when the atomic bomb was dropped. And the ramifications of atomic weaponry, of course, are with us today. So that was a type of ethical decision where two bads had to be considered. And a decision had to be made in the minds of the decision makers that the less bad thing occur. We can argue with that vigorously and vociferously on both sides, and it has been argued over the years. And I don't have the correct answer to tell you as to which was right and wrong, but I do have a great deal of sympathy for the people who were living in that day and age and had to make that terrible decision. Sometimes you get to make a decision that's much clearer between right and wrong, something that's obviously good or obviously bad, and God bless us if we get to make ethical decisions that are like that. But we have to learn to recognize the ethical issues. We have to gather as many facts as we can. It's important not to rush to judgment here. We need to determine, well, wait a minute, let's see what the total picture is here before we make our decision. So get the facts in order before you proceed with the decision. Cool the process down a little bit until you have your facts straight, because you don't want to be in a situation where your decision then is questions, well, didn't you realize X? And you didn't realize X because you didn't get that fact. You want to evaluate all your options. You want to see which is the best of all possible options. Again, if you have a couple of bad options, you want to make the best bad option. So take the time and the thought to evaluate those options and to choose the one that seems to make the most sense and to address the issue most ethically. You want to consult appropriately. Don't try to make difficult ethical decisions by yourself. Get input from others, certainly your supervisor, maybe other colleagues. Make a determination. For instance, let's go back to the very first thing I mentioned about administrative discharge of a patient from treatment. This is an ethical decision because you're deciding that somebody needs to leave treatment. That means they get cut off from some of the services that might help them to get into recovery. If you're going to make a decision like that, it shouldn't be rote. It shouldn't be automatic. It shouldn't be, well, the rule says this, they're out. There should be a consideration. You should gather those facts. Well, what were the circumstances of this? Was this a first-time offense? Did this action affect other patients here or make it unsafe for them to be here? Or was it something really that the patient had, the consequences all fall on them? What are your options here? Can you kick the patient into a higher level of care? Or in some instances, is your decision that maybe they can't tolerate an inpatient setting or a more restrictive setting, so we'll give them treatment in a lower level of care. We'll put them in a less restrictive setting. You have to consult appropriately with your fellow colleagues and your supervisor so that it's not you just making the decision, because this would be a momentous decision to terminate someone's treatment. And then, of course, you have to make the decision. Eventually, no matter how difficult it is, you have to be the one who says, okay, it's time to go ahead and make our decision. In the case of the patient, we're either going to keep them in treatment or no, we have to discharge them. Then you test it out. You talk to your colleagues again and say, okay, we've made the decision. How's it seem? Seems like the right decision. Let's go with it. Then you act. You go tell the patient, hey, we're going to keep you, but we put in some restrictions, or you're going to have to do these certain things, or we're going to move you into another level of care, or whatever the decision might be in that kind of a case. And then finally, you're going to reflect and learn. And this is very important. It's always good to do a little autopsy of difficult decisions to make sure that you did them correctly. And you'll have the opportunity then to learn for the next time and maybe do it better if it needs to be done better. Okay, so basically, in a nutshell, you're going to stop, you're going to look closely, you're going to listen to others, you're going to decide, you're going to act, and then you're going to do that reflect and learn piece. And we're going to skip these cases because we're out of time. I think they'll probably be posted. You can look at them. There's a couple of fun ones up there. But I want to get to the resources. The first resource that I would recommend is what I did last time, the Book of Ethics. I don't know if you can see this or not, but expert guidance for professionals who treat addiction. So very focused on the addiction treatment field. An important resource to have, I think, and to look through. Lots of good stuff in there. Another resource I would highly recommend, although this is an expensive little paperback, I have to say. It costs $135. But it's worth having because it's the Legal Action Center's Confidentiality and Communication, a Guide to Federal Drug and Alcohol Confidentiality Law and HIPAA, and it's from the Legal Action Center. I think this is the latest copy, the 2006 version. It's good to have on hand. It can answer all kinds of questions about what to do with subpoenas, court orders, all that nitty-gritty stuff. Lots of interpretation of the law, of the federal law. And then I also mentioned a chapter from the book by Miller and Rolnick, Motivational Interviewing, Preparing People for Change. They have a good chapter in there, chapter 12, on ethical considerations. And lastly, the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, which is at Santa Clara University. If you're just interested in ethics in general, I got my definition of ethics from there. I did, if you saw it, I did give you that annotation on the definition itself. And they're a good place to go. You can look them up at scu.edu/ethics. And they do a lot of good ethical discussions on there if you're interested in pursuing this further. And I'd like to say thank you for your time and attention. And I hope that moving forward you will act ethically, and I hope I will as well, understanding that it's not always easy to do so, but it's always important to do so. So thanks for joining us this morning.